When elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. The Dominion War was probably one of the more interesting pieces of Star Trek lore, as it's something kind of unique. We see an actual conflict between the Federation and another empire, and it's actually detailed. Sure, other wars exist within the Star Trek universe. Certainly the Xindi War and various conflicts between the Federation and the Klingons are a thing, but they're rarely explored in much depth, like at all. Hell, Star Trek Discovery had more soap opera vibes where we focused on character relationships, and there just happened to be a war in the background. The Xindi is the next closest thing I can think of, but that's hardly a war in my opinion. Something that I see rarely explored, though, is the impacts of the conflicts on the more minor powers. We have a focus on the Federation, the Dominion, the Klingons, Cardassians, Romulans, and others, but nothing about those governments that didn't, or perhaps couldn't, play a major role. So let's take a look at the powers that really just had to sit back and watch as the Alpha and Beta Quadrant tore themselves apart.
Now do you begin to see, Commander? That without any help from either one of us, they've managed to start their own little war out here.
The first two I'll be breaking down are quite obvious. That is specifically the Maquis and the Bajoran Republic. When we analyze the Maquis, it's kind of an interesting subject that was given basically a one-liner to explain the impact of the Dominion on them. They were effectively wiped out without much of a fight. We see the vestiges of the Maquis, and I'll get into that in a minute or two, but what really strikes me as interesting with them is the fact that their fate in universe could have went very, very different. I've already done a couple of videos on this, and if I can find them, I'll link them below, but the Maquis had the opportunity to join the Dominion and not be obliterated. They were a very short-sighted group of freedom fighters, and so chose not to join the Dominion idiotically. But the potential was there. The Dominion, as we know, didn't really care who lives nor who dies. They just wanted subjugation. The Cardassians jumped on the chance to go from a regional power to a superpower and so accepted their blessing. The Maquis could have done the same thing. While I think it would have been tenuous for the Maquis, there could have been some kind of bargain struck between the Maquis and the Cardassians. The Federation, which had always been proud of its role as a government that ignored its people, were never going to help them anyway, nor give them any kind of rights to the planets they were on. In fact, they indirectly approved of weapons of mass destruction being used against their own colonies. Just look at what Cisco did. So, failing the good guys doing anything, you go with the one that lets you survive. Their blind hatred for the Cardassians wouldn't allow that, of course, and so the Maquis were all genocided in the blink of an eye. The survivors of that onslaught would go on to make waves to save what few of them still remained, but they were never a threat, nor really heard of again. This is a failure of both the Dominion and the Federation alliance, in my opinion. Either side could have really used them as a great ally.
Right now, I'm going to enjoy this moment.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the Bajoran government
and the Promenade Merchants Association,
I officially welcome you to Deep Space Nine.
The natural next step to look at is that of the Bajoran Republic. The Bajorans are also kind of a weird one because we have to look at the official and the unofficial stance. Also, the opinion of whom the Bajorans backed is biased because we stay with Kira as one of the main characters and whom is very clearly against the Dominion. However, the actions of the government outwardly was beyond neutral. Bajoran space always was basically just a place the current administration could park their vehicles and utilize their technology. Bajorans worked with the Dominion and the Federation. We see ships, mechanics, and more working towards the prosperity of whichever power had their war vessels parked in the front yard. Now, that's not to say they didn't have a preference, and certainly the public would have demonstrations against the Dominion, but ultimately they were neutral, and due to this, did not receive much, if any, backlash. To be fair, the only reason they were neutral was because Space Jesus, which hailed from a different empire, told them to do so. Wait a second. So we have a messiah figure that is basically the pinnacle of a religion, influencing how a nation treats another nation to the point of wanting to actively assisting said nation, regardless of any actual values. Huh. This truly is fiction, for we never see that in real life. Also, on a side note, a lot of people like to think that Bajor is basically Vichy France. Honestly, I originally thought this as well, but when you actually research Vichy France, they were a pretty big fascist government that didn't like a certain kind of people. So this comparison, in my mind, is probably not right.
if the Federation had listened to the Ferengi Alliance, there never would have been a war.
Because we would have surrendered a long time ago.
No, we would have reached an accommodation. We would have sat down across a negotiation table and hammered out a peace treaty. One that both sides could live with.
The next nation to be analyzed would be that of the Ferengi Alliance. The alliance itself would remain relatively neutral throughout the entirety of the war, though I say neutral in the same way that the United States was neutral in World War II before their entry. Possibly one rung below, but either way. The Ferengi ultimately tried to push for a peace, one that neither side would be happy with, but at least both could agree on. This was never accepted by either side, and ultimately the Ferengi found themselves choosing between the Dominion and the Federation Alliance. Throughout the war, it would seem that the Dominion would largely be antagonistic towards the Ferengi, not above kidnapping or even threatening the leadership, though this could be in response to the fact that the Ferengi continued to supply the Federation and had passive assistance. We also know that there were discussions for the Ferengi to join the Federation Alliance. Unfortunately, the actual outcome of this isn't completely known, and it's unlikely the Ferengi officially joined them in the war. During said war, Starfleet did have suspicions, but had not verified that the Sona had thrown their lot in with the Dominion, which is weird given that the Dominion was constantly sending ships to Sona space, but what can you do? The Sona would create the much-needed drug Ketracel White, and while they did not appear to actively assist in engagements, were assisting in passive ways. After the war, there didn't seem to be much political fallout for the group either, though they had their own problems. We don't get too much information on the Zinkethi, though we are aware that the Dominion attempted to start a war between the Zinkethi and the Federation prior to the war to end all wars. It is likely that they could do little to assist the Juggernauts and simply stayed out of it. I couldn't really find any other canon evidence. The next two I'm kind of grouping together because we know very little about how they impacted the war. The Miradorn and Tholians had signed a non-aggression pact with the Dominion shortly before said war had begun. While this does not mean they may not have entered the conflict at some other time, given the fact that we don't see them at all, it's probably reasonable to assume that the powers stayed neutral. I'd also note that likely where the Tholians are located, especially when we look at most maps and where the Dominion War was occurring, unless they were assisting the Dominion, the Tholians would not have been much assistance. At least the Federation. The Nazicans and Gorn also had their issues with the Federation, but likely had no real way to substantially assist either side and stayed out of it. Perhaps a more intriguing organization to consider was that of the Orions and the Orion Syndicate. While it's never blatantly stated, a lot of sources seem to infer that the Orions are now a member state of the Klingon Empire, or at least the Empire has a lot of influence over them. This aside, we do know that the Syndicate has consistently had a lot of animosity with the Federation, and has attempted to sabotage attempts at peace with them multiple times. We see the Syndicate even actively working against Starfleet when its members attempt to assassinate a Klingon ambassador. It is likely they would have continued to work against the Federation throughout the war, and when the war was lost, went back into the shadows. In the end, the smaller nations and empires attempted to stand aside as the two Juggernaut alliances fought in their front and backyards. They would take collateral damage, and I theorize they probably used this as political points against the Federation in the future, but at least during the war, there wasn't much they could do. These are my thoughts. What do you guys think? What do you think the smaller empires did? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.